Michell has always been a family-run business. Our founder, John Michell, started off, he was an engineer, master engineer, and he'd done all sorts of bits and pieces for lots of local companies. And then he started making parts for another local turntable company. Made those for a long time, but all the time he was looking at how we could improve the parts and how we could make a better turntable. That company itself moved away, and they left John Michell the building those turntables under license. So that was his real start into making turntables. And then in the late 70s he started making his own, and then in the early 1980s he made the Gyro, which is what the turntable that we're really known for. The tradition with the turntables of the time was to make a wooden box, put all your parts in there, the motor was part of the turntable, but all in one box. And John's idea, because he thought differently to an audio guy, because he was an engineer, was that box must resonate. So if you've got sound in a room, that box must be resonating. So strip all that away, let's make this an open turntable. That way you haven't got a box to influence the sound. That's where it all started. There was a fashion at the time to make a suspended turntable. People were putting the springs under compression, which is great, but it means any vibrations or anything in the room is going to make the whole thing wobble like this because it's sitting on top of springs. John turned that basically on its head, hang it on the springs, so the springs in an extension, and that way the movement is reduced. So the centre of gravity of the turntable is reduced, or lowered, and it avoids a lot of the problems of the traditional styles of turntables at the time. The main job of a turntable is to isolate the platter surface from any vibrations, either structural coming up or the speakers in the room exciting the turntable itself, so resonance and things like that. You're going to need a lot of mass to actually deal with that, but in different ways. So you're going to need isolation from vibrations coming up, so that's why the whole thing hangs on springs. And then the platter itself and the chassis needs to be heavy enough to stop itself vibrating and resonating within the room. John's philosophy was to obviously improve everything where he can. The initial Gyro deck, it was an acrylic plinth, so acrylic being quite a dense, dead material, and it was a new material at the time, not many people were using it. He started off making that, a big plinth out of acrylic, hang the turntable essential parts on the springs to isolate them. But then he's also thinking, what other parts can I do that are different to other people to improve upon the sound quality and the engineering of it? He chose to then evolve the bearing, so we completely changed the bearing on its head. Pretty much all other turntable manufacturers, you have your base of your turntable, your bearing sits in there, there's a spindle attached to the platter, and it drops down and it sits on a single thrust ball, and that's what gives you your turning. That's great, but all the oil sits at the bottom of the bearing, and it takes a lot of pressure to actually push any oil up, and you're not always fully lubricating that bearing, which is going to give you noise, rumble, things like that. So John literally spun it on its head. He put the point of rotation at the top of the bearing, so the spindle's now attached to the base, the body of the bearing is attached to the platter. There's a well at the bottom of our bearing which is full of oil. You've got the bearing spindle like that, thrust ball on the top, bearing body sits over the top, and in the bore of the actual body is a modified Archimedean screw, so it's a spiral machined on the inside. So that means all the time that turntable's turning, it's drawing oil up that spiral, so it lubricates the entire bearing all the way up to the ball at the top. Then there's an offset hole in the spindle, so the waste oil goes back down into the well. That has lots of different benefits to a bearing. So one, you're fully lubricating as you go. Any minute little pieces of metal that may be coming off, they're only going to be tiny, but they all collect at the bottom, they're not interfering with the ball at the top. So the end result is you end up with an extremely quiet bearing. Rumble, things like that are very, very, very minute. You're not really going to be able to measure them. So that was one of his major sort of innovations. We have three main models. Our entry-level turntable is a TecnoDec. The middle of the road is the Gyro models, and then the flagship is the Orbe. The development started with the TecnoDec, so in the middle. So that's where John started in the 80s designing the TecnoDec. To develop an entry-level turntable, so the TecnoDec, we literally strip everything off of a TecnoDec that still allows you to play a record. So the platter material is the same, it's still high density acetal. The motor is the same, it's in a separate aluminium, it's all machined out of a single piece of aluminium. The bearing assembly, although it's size-wise is different, the style is the same, so it's still a recirculating bearing. And then, because it's an unsuspended turntable, we support it with some rubber feet. In its own right, it's an extremely good turntable, and it's got a lot of attributes that you wouldn't find in a turntable at that price. You then move up to the Gyro, so you're then onto a suspended turntable, so it's hanging on springs. You have a heavy chassis to the turntable, supported by an acrylic base. Then you've got the same platter that we use for the TecnoDec, but then we attach the gold weights, which is what everybody sees when they turn around and around. The idea of that is they're around the perimeter of the platter. It gives the whole platter momentum, so your speed stability is very good. The motor is really only keeping that on speed. The platter itself is turning under its own steam most of the time. Oil recirculating bearing, separate motor unit. The only interaction between the motor and the turntable is the drive belt. There is no other, so any noise, any vibrations by that motor, they're not going to interfere with the deck. You then move up to the Orbe. So we have 2 levels of acrylic isolation, separated by pinpoints. So from the first base, you've got the feet and the legs and the first acrylic base. The second part sits on 3 pinpoints. So it's minimal contact area, which really helps with any vibrations coming up through the deck. Same chassis that we use on the Gyro, so it's heavy, it's got weights in it, but we then apply a mastic material underneath which deadens the chassis itself, and that's for airborne vibrations. So when the speakers are playing in the room, especially if you turn it up, there are elements that could resonate, but that mastic takes that away. You then go up to the platter. We've removed the weights, and now we've got a big thick acetal platter, so it's a lot heavier and it's still the same dense material, but it just acts to control the sound even more than the Gyro. You're then into the realms of very small increases in performance with all these different materials. So the difference basically between a Gyro and an Orbe, the Orbe controls bass a lot better than the Gyro, and what that does for a sound stage is, because the bass is under control, it opens up the mid-range and everything else sort of snaps into focus. The other thing we do with the Orbe is that the motor and the controller and the most advanced we've ever made. The Orbe motor is a servo motor, so all the time it's turning, it's talking back to the control unit. It basically reports its RPM. If that changes for any reason, the voltage is increased or decreased, and so it keeps that platter turning, and speed stability is really good. House sound is a difficult one, and the reason we do things ends up being our house sound. So we do things in reverse. It's not we're aiming for things to sound like this. What we're aiming to do is isolate the vinyl from as many different influences as possible, so that when it plays, you're going to get basically the music as the artist and the recording engineer. That's how they intended you to hear this. So all the details and everything that's encoded in that disc, that's what we're trying to extract, without any influence from speakers in the room or vibrations up through your equipment and all that sort of thing. Where it becomes a development process is choosing different materials, different engineering principles to achieve that level of isolation. Now it's a bit different with, say, a speaker manufacturer. They voice their equipment to sound in a certain way. With a turntable, it's a bit different because you're not voicing a turntable. All you're trying to do is isolate this thing from any influence. The materials and everything that allow you to do that invariably become more and more expensive, and you need to use more of them and whatever to achieve that. So from a TecnoDec to an Orbe, you're introducing a lot more materials and a lot more techniques to do that. that's why price increases, you know, and that's what gives you the performance increases. It is diminishing returns, so the more you spend, if you take a gyro as your average, you're going to get really good performance, really good performance. And obviously there's lots of other elements for your system and whatever. And then when you move up to an Orbe, you're going to get an improvement in that. But then you go up to the next level, and some of these turntables that are a fortune, every step you go up, the increase in performance is smaller each step, but you need to spend that to get it, and that's where you are really. The Orbe currently is our flagship model. We are developing above that. The idea is that we will develop another flagship turntable and then let the new technologies that we're developing for that then filter down into some more models that obviously different price bands, so bring it down. It was the same when we developed the cartridge. A few years ago, set about developing a cartridge. We developed the top of the range, the Q6M, and then used the technology that was developed for that and filtered it down into, so we got 3 models. When we started developing our cartridges, we have a lot of knowledge of materials and engineering techniques, things like that, but we'd never developed a cartridge. So the quickest way and the easiest way for us was to partner with an expert. So we started out with a company called Benz in Switzerland. That didn't work out, unfortunately. And then we partnered with these new guys. But when we did partner with Benz, what it taught us was that we didn't want to take someone else's cartridge and just rebox it and sell it. That wasn't going to work for us. So this was going to be a Michell cartridge through and through. So we started working with the new partners, explained exactly what we wanted it to do. They explained to us what different things influenced the performance of a cartridge. The Q6M, which is the one we developed first, we developed that without cost being a factor. We just wanted to make what's the best cartridge we can make, you know. So that's where we went with that. They developed a generator inside the cartridge, basically to our spec and to achieve what we were looking to achieve. We developed the housing for the cartridge, so using our materials expertise, we use different material to do that. We use carbon loaded acrylic for the Q6M. It's really good at stopping any airborne vibration exciting the cartridge, so it's very isolated. And we also realized that we needed some mass within the cartridge. One thing, we need to bolt everything to it. Having a fair size piece of like aluminium within the cartridge gives you somewhere for the resonance to go. We headed down that road. And then when we got the prototypes back, that was when we really started to learn what it takes to make a cartridge. Because you think you do, and you've talked to all the experts and everything else, and then when you get these and you start tweaking pieces and you start using different cantilever materials, different stylus profiles, those sort of things, then you realise actually this is quite an involved, it's not a black art, but there's definitely some, you need to have a clear vision of what you want this thing to sound like, how good you want it to sound, and that's where we started really. The Q6M is we chose boron as the cantilever material. It's very stiff, light, and allows the stylus tip to transfer all the detail into the cartridge. Aluminium, things like that, which we use in the Q6E, it's great at doing that, but just not as good as boron. It's one of those things, it's just the next material up that you need to use. So the Q6M uses an ultra precise microline stylus tip, diamond, through a boron cantilever, and then we played around with different coil mass. So most low output moving coil cartridges operate at around about 4 millivolts, but by reducing that, we found that we could get more detail from the disc. So without reducing it to a silly level where people can't amplify it, we chose to reduce it to 0.25, and that way it just gives the cartridge it's more dynamic, everything opens up, and you get more detail from the disc. Our customer base goes back right to when we started making turntables. We still service all of our turntables, even the ones that John made under license which were effectively someone else's turntable. We still service those. We service any of the models we've ever made. We keep, although it's limited, we keep spare parts for all those turntables. So we've only ever had one that we couldn't repair. That was damaged in an earthquake in Italy. They sent us basically a carrier bag full of parts, and we said, unfortunately, we haven't got enough bits to make this again. But yeah, we regularly service all those old turntables, and that's one thing that we like to be able to do. We don't want you to buy one of our pieces of kit and not be able to maintain it, not be able to service it. The idea is, if you buy one of our turntables, you keep it forever, and it will run forever. You know, there's no. We make it that way. We make a piece of kit that's reliable. We don't want it to break down. We don't want you on the phone all the time saying this doesn't work, that doesn't work. So that's one of our key values, is this thing needs to be reliable, and you keep it forever. And then we like to allow you to upgrade it. So if you buy one of our turntables, you'll be able to buy an upgraded power supply for it. You'll be able to buy little different tweaks here and there. There's always an avenue to improve the performance. It's not infinite, unfortunately, but there's, you know, you can. There's always somewhere you can go with it. The values for our business are: number one, it has to sound. It has to be a good quality piece of kit. We want you to get some substance from the turntable. We don't want to sell you a piece of MDF or whatever. Value for money is very important for us. One of John's founding values was, this thing has to be value for money. I don't want to be ripping people off. So when you pick one of our turntables up, you can tell instantly this is a decent bit of kit, and it's going to do the job. You haven't been fobbed off with some magical technology or anything like that. You can see where your money's going. That's probably what sets us apart from a lot of the others.